That's all right. All right. Gonna give everybody a couple more minutes to come back in. So we got pretty far last time, and that review will give us a good platform to, I think we're going to be able to finish up, which is good. So we will go ahead and jump in a bit. Okay, so we talked about observation learning. I'll just do it from here. Can I do that? Yeah, cool. Let's go from there. Awesome. All right, so observational learning, this is attributed, not completely, but this is one of the ideas that was studied pretty heavily by a guy called Bandura, who's one of my favorite psychologists to talk about. And so he, in addition to this, he also came up with this idea that we'll talk about much later in the semester, called reciprocal determinism, which I think is really cool, really smart. But through his Bobo doll experiment, which we talked about a bit already, he discovered that observational learning went all the way down to when we're small, maybe especially when we're small. We pick up things from our environment. I don't know if we've talked about, because there's a very good crash course video that I will probably link on the description of the YouTube video that I'll post today for this lecture about the Bobo doll experiment, which we'll talk about in a second. So the Bobo doll experiment, yeah, I'll just wait to explain it, but it was very famous and sort of paved the way for this understanding of observational learning, and this guy Bandura put it on. So observational learning requires 4 basic tenets. Okay, so you have to be able to pay attention to the model. If you're like me and you have clinical issues with paying attention, this can be a little tricky, because if you're not paying attention, you're obviously not going to internalize whatever behavior you were supposed to be paying attention to. You have to remember what has been observed, because it just goes in one ear, not the other. That's obviously not going to be super helpful to learning a behavior. You have to be capable of performing the observed behavior. So, the Winter Olympics are closing up. I can watch all of the snowboard half pipe I want and even be explained like exactly how they do what they do. I am not capable of performing that behavior. So observational learning in this case is not really possible. And then motivated to demonstrate the behavior. So if it's something that I see and I'm like, that's gross, I don't want to do that. I'm not motivated to copy what I'm seeing. So all 4 of those things have to be present. Pay attention, you have to be able to remember it, you have to be able to do it, you have to be motivated to do it. So with all that in mind, so this is another example. So I like to think about this in a language learning term. So if you speak multiple languages, or even you just speak English, like going from place to place, like we speak different English in South Carolina than somebody in California does. Like our accents are different. We use different vernacular. They have different words for different things. So you pick up on a lot of that kind of stuff from observational learning, from hearing people use different words in different contexts, exhibit behaviors in different contexts, and then incorporating what they do into what you do. So an example they use here is hand gestures, how those change from country to country. Also applies to language and a whole bunch of other stuff. All right, the Bobo doll experiment. Okay, very famous experiment. Definitely worth a watch on that video because it explains it better than I will do. But had 76 preschool children placed in the room with an adult. So we got 2 groups. So group over here, the kids see the adults acting aggressively towards the doll. So it's this like blow-up doll looks like a clown. And they're shouting at the doll, punching it, hitting it, all this kind of stuff, kicking it, calling it mean names. And And in this other group, the kids see the adults playing peacefully with the doll and with the toy in the room. And then, after the kids have been exposed to those two types of behavior, so you have one group that sees the adults being mean, one group that sees the adults being kind to it. The adults leave and the experimenters watch what happens, because the kids start to play with the doll too. And what they found was that the kids who observed the aggressive models were more likely to mimic that behavior. So we'll see some pictures of the kids also exhibiting that kind of aggressive behavior towards the doll, hitting it, calling it names, things like that. And then over here, the kids that saw the adults being nice were also more likely to exhibit that behavior. Boys were more likely than girls to model aggression, physical aggression, especially if they viewed a male adult doing the same thing. Take from that what you will. And then boys and girls were actually equally likely to display verbal aggression. Physical aggression was skewed towards the fellas. All right, so you can see up here at the top, the adults being aggressive to it, and then the kids doing the exact same thing. And these are little kids, so preschool children, 3, 4, 5 years old. They just do what they see. And if that is not a harrowing reminder, I would think that like most of you guys aren't parents yet, but that kids that you have around you and in your life pick up your behaviors, and definitely look to older people as models. So just be careful. All right, so here's a good question: the independent variable and dependent variable in this experiment. So we talked all the way back in chapter 1. Independent variable is the thing that I'm manipulating, and the dependent variable is the result of that manipulation. So in this case, the independent variable is the kids seeing those two groups. So whether or not they saw the adults being aggressive or the adults being kind to the doll, the adult's behavior is the independent variable, because I'm changing that in between the groups. And then my dependent variable, my result of that manipulation, is going to be how the kids respond in kind. Okay, so the kids' behavior in that case is the dependent variable. All right, so this is sort of a chicken or the egg kind of question of whether violence in the media, violence in video games, things like that can contribute to aggressive behavior. So it's correlational. So we talked about how that doesn't imply causation, but there does seem to be a correlation between exposure to violent media and violent behavior, because we talked about that observational learning element. It may not be as observable or as strong, but there is some correlational evidence to say that these two things are connected, at least. And so on the opposite end of that spectrum, so we have one study. Researchers had parents change the television shows their preschool was reviewing, substituting aggression-laden programming with high-quality pro-social and educational programs. They use here the Sesame Street. I don't know about you guys, but I watched a lot of Sesame Street growing up. I was definitely a PBS kid, so watching a lot of Zoom, watched a lot of like Dragon Tales, Arthur, things like that. Because my mom wanted me watching that stuff and not like Dragon Ball Z. She was not completely successful in that, to be completely honest. But in this experiment, they substituted a group of kids aggression-laden programming with things like Arthur or Zaboomafoo or whatever. And what they found was that they did have gains. They did perform better cognitively, perform better behaviorally, but those gains did not last all that long. So you can see, we talked about extinction earlier on in the chapter. So that conditioning element does go away after a while. That also applies with observational learning and cognition. So also interesting finding here at the bottom, more positive impact for boys from low-income households. This is an example of a finding that we would not be able to take a whole lot from based on this specific study, but then we could look at specifically that element and say, okay, well, I want to do a study on the role of socioeconomic status with, cognitive observational learning and being able to change programming, things like that. So that's a good example of how research can answer some questions, but then also create other questions, because the cycle has to continue. Right. So there's also this idea of latent learning. We're not always doing this consciously. So this is something that we're not trying to do all the time, but latent learning that occurs without awareness and regardless of reinforcement and is not evident until needed. So you're not thinking about learning these things, but you still are. So found that rats learn at different rates depending on reinforcement. So you can see that the reinforcement in the long term actually doesn't have a great effect on your ability to learn something, because you eventually learn to link that behavior exclusively with the reward itself, and you are less likely to perform it independently. So that is a good example of how partial reinforcement is actually more effective in the long term than continuous reinforcement. You can see here this finding at the bottom, rats who received reinforcement on day 11 showed a decrease in error rate, suggesting that learning occurred in the previous 11 days. So they were actually learning the whole time without reinforcement, and then they got the reinforcement, and their learning actually decreased. So reinforcement is not always, especially in the long term, the most effective way to learn. Is also not the most effective way to influence behavior. So behaviorism is becoming increasingly unpopular with a lot of people who work. So like my wife is a speech therapist, but she does a lot of cognitive work as well. And behaviorism is becoming less and less popular because of this link to this continuous need to have behaviors reinforced, and how it can actually be very detrimental on a child's psyche in the long term to link their behavior so consistently with either getting rewarded or not, because that has ties to their like intrinsic value and their perception of how others see them and things like that. Just in the long term creates some very negative side effects. Okay, so going back to the latent learning thing, we're doing this in space a lot. And so if you've ever been in a place and like somebody's asked you how to get to a certain area or a house or something like that, and you can just tell them, and you never like consciously thought about like, oh, how do I get to this place? You just kind of do it because of repeated exposure to I go on this street and go on this street, and you just do it. So that's latent learning. And you've also created a cognitive map. So it's a mental representation of physical space. So you do this all the time. So like I have a cognitive map of my house. Like I know which room is where, and then which stuff is in which room. I didn't have to think about that a whole lot. Like I didn't have to like sit myself down and be like, okay, well, this is the living room. This is where the TV is. Back there is the kitchen. Your room is in there. That's where you sleep. Like it's just, I created a cognitive map in my head over repeated exposures, and that's just how it works. Aids in the navigation of our environment. Developing these maps can occur without reinforcement, and frequently does occur without reinforcement, because again, I wasn't, every time I got it correct where our bathroom was, my wife wasn't like, good job, Will, thankfully, because that would have been kind of embarrassing. So there's two ways we can do this, place cells and grid cells. So I personally am more of a person that I remember where things are better visually. So based on like, I remember that tree, or I remember, that weird house with the gray door. And then some other people create these grid cells. So you've ever seen like a map of a city. It looks like a grid. So people's brains work that way. And our ability to do both of those things impacts our ability to create these cognitive maps. All right. So that is, okay, it's only 9:45, but that is about all I have for you guys today. If y'all have any questions, I'll hang out here for a minute to answer any of them. But next time, what we're going to do is pretty much exactly what we did today. We will start with the Kahoot, because I think that more people are here, because I know several of y'all have to get to school. We'll start with the Kahoot, finishing the back half of chapter 5, and then we'll get into chapter 6, which is about memory, which is super interesting. So learning and memory are very similar concepts. There's a lot of crossover between the two of them. We'll talk about a lot of how the ideas we talked about in the learning chapter bleed into our ability to remember things over a long period of time. A lot of vocabulary that crosses over, a lot of concepts that are pretty similar. but yeah, that's all I have for y'all. I'll post about your assignment tomorrow. If not tomorrow, early Friday. I'll hang out here for a minute or two if y'all have any questions. But other than that, hope y'all have a wonderful Wednesday, and I will see you next week.